The lacquer box sat on the 11th table from the door in the private dining room of the Signal Seoul, on the 76th floor of Lotte World Tower, at 7:34 p.m. on the 14th of April. It was small, no larger than a Bible, and it had been carved in Tongyong in 1974 by a man whose hands had already begun to shake from the war he did not talk about. The mother-of-pearl inlay on the lid showed a crane in mid-flight over a river that had never existed anywhere except in the carver's memory of a village that no longer stood. Inside the box, beneath a folded square of hanji paper, the color of weak tea, lay a silver wedding band, scratched along its inner circumference with a date in two calendars, the Gregorian and the lunar, and a name so small that a jeweler would need a loupe to read it. No one at the table knew the box was there. It had been placed under the 11th chair, wrapped in a linen napkin, by a woman who had walked in as a florist's assistant at 5:12 that afternoon and walked out again at 5:19, and whose face on the hotel's security footage would later be identified as belonging to no one on the guest list. 11 floors below the box, in the marble lobby bar of the same tower, Kang Min-jae sat alone at a corner table with a glass of andong soju he had not yet touched. He was 41 years old. He wore a navy overcoat that had cost more than the night manager downstairs earned in a year, folded once over the empty chair beside him, and beneath it a charcoal suit cut in Milan by a tailor who had also dressed his father. His engagement ring, platinum, thin as a promise, caught the amber light from the pendant lamp above him. In 4 hours, he would be married, in the garden of his family's mansion in Pyeongchang-dong, to the daughter of the Yu family, whose shipping company owned 12% of the Pacific containers between Busan and Long Beach. The wedding had been called by the Chosun Ilbo the social event of the year. He had read the phrase twice. He had laughed once, a short, dry sound that no one in the bar heard. He had then thought, without wanting to, of his mother's face the previous Tuesday over the anchovy broth she had made him drink at her table in Bukchon, and of the way she had said, quietly, without lifting her eyes from the bowl, "I ain't, some doors you close. You close for both of you." He had dismissed it then. He dismissed it now. He watched the elevator on the far wall of the lobby for 41 minutes. He did not know he was waiting. On paper, Kang Min-jae was the third-generation head of the Kong Brotherhood, a name that had, in the years since his father's retirement, been quietly re-registered under 7 different corporate umbrellas listed on the KOSPI and 1 private holding company incorporated in Singapore. He owned 4 buildings in Yeoksam-dong, a distillery in Andong, a controlling stake in a maritime logistics firm that moved automotive parts between Incheon and Vladivostok, and a foundation in his grandmother's name that funded scholarships for orphaned girls in 3 provinces. He had signed, the previous Thursday at 11:47 in the morning, a pre-nuptial agreement with the Yu family, whose 7th clause guaranteed him a directorship on the board of Yu Shipping in exchange for the merger of his logistics firm with theirs, a document his lawyer had described, without irony, as the cleanest paper he had ever drafted. He had been married once before, 10 years earlier, to a woman named Adayes Ifechi Kong, born in Enugu, raised in Lagos and then in London, whose Igbo middle name meant the one God has brought. They had divorced 5 years ago, in a proceeding so quiet that the Financial Times had reported the separation of their joint holdings as a strategic restructuring. He was now engaged to Yu Ji-won, 29, a graduate of the Wharton School and the only daughter of Chairman Yu Sang-chul, whose family had bowed to his family across a black lacquer table in Hanam-dong the previous December and asked, in the old form, for the joining of 2 houses. The engagement had been announced on the 5th of January. The wedding had been scheduled for tonight. Every seat in the garden was filled by someone whose name appeared in either the business pages or the culture pages of at least 3 national dailies. On paper, his mother had warned him 3 times. The first warning had come at the Jeza for his father in the autumn, when she had set down the small brass bowl of rice on the ancestral table, and had not lifted her hand away from it for a long moment, as though she were pressing the grain into the wood. She had looked at him across the low table, at the candle between them, and had said nothing. That was the first warning. The second had come in her kitchen in Bukchon on a Sunday afternoon, when she had served him doenjang jjigae in the same earthenware bowl his grandmother had used, and had stood at the counter with her back to him, slicing a pear into eighths, and had told him that his grandmother, in her last week at Asun Medical Center, had asked to see Adayez one more time, and had not been granted the visit. She had said the word granted with an emphasis that fell on him like a small stone. The third warning had come at the gate of the Pyeongchang-dong house on the morning of the wedding rehearsal, when she had stopped him with a hand on his sleeve and had told him, without any inflection, that she had invited someone to the ceremony he had not expected. She had not said the name. She had only said, "Family should not become strangers, Aina, especially the ones who kept us fed." And then she had walked into the house. That was the third warning, delivered as 3 tableaux, a bowl of rice, a sliced pear, a hand on a sleeve, and he had understood none of them. He had been wrong. He did not yet know how wrong. The message arrived at 6:53 p.m. It came as a hand-delivered envelope, cream-colored, unmarked, given to the concierge of the Signal by a courier who had paid the 8,001 parking fee in cash and whose motorcycle helmet had obscured his face from the 4 cameras that recorded his 1 minute and 11-second passage through the lobby. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, printed on matte paper, 4 by 6 inches. It showed 2 young people, no older than 30, standing under the balcony of a rented apartment in Sinchon in the rain, laughing, the woman's dark hand pressed flat against the wet lapel of the man's cheap gray suit. On the back of the photograph, in his own handwriting from 11 years ago, in blue ink that had bled once at the edges, was the sentence he had forgotten he had written. "No matter how rich or powerful we become, I'll kiss you every anniversary under the open sky." He read it twice. He set the photograph down on the table beside the untouched glass of Andong soju. He finished the drink in one long swallow that burned his throat in a way he had not permitted himself to feel in years. He made one phone call to his driver, waiting in the underground car park, and told the man to bring the car around. He waited another 41 minutes before he stood. He did not know why he waited. He only knew that if he stood any sooner, he would arrive at the house in Pyeongchang-dong before he had understood what he was walking into, and he had begun to suspect, with the slow, cold certainty of a man who had spent 20 years reading rooms for a living, that he was about to walk into a room he had not read. The garden of the Pyeongchang-dong house had been arranged with a patience that only very old money knows how to buy. Champagne-colored roses had been flown in from a farm outside Bogota the previous morning and arranged along the aisle by a florist who had trained at Sogetsu in Kyoto. A 12-piece orchestra from the Seoul Philharmonic played, under the direction of a conductor who had once refused a knighthood, the second movement of a Fauré quartet at a volume that did not intrude on conversation. 341 guests sat in white folding chairs on the lawn, in a light that was the specific gold of a Seoul April at 7:12 in the evening. The bride wore a gown of silk mikado, cut by a house in the 16th arrondissement of Paris that had dressed the wives of 3 French presidents. She was radiant. She was 29. She was, by every measurable standard the world respected, the correct woman for the man about to kiss her. The officiant announced the words. Min Jae leaned forward. He kissed his new wife. The applause rose from the guests like a wave breaking on a beach very far away. And then, from the back of the garden, near the rose arch closest to the eastern hedge, someone began to cry. It was not a quiet cry. It was not a dramatic cry. It was the sound of a woman who had held a grief in the base of her throat for 5 years and had been ambushed by a single, unremarkable second in a spring garden. Every head turned. The orchestra faltered, one violin at a time, and then stopped. The applause thinned into silence. She stood alone in a dress the color of dark honey, her hand pressed against her mouth, her shoulders trembling in a way she was trying and failing to control. She was tall. Her dark skin caught the last of the golden light. She was Adese Ifechi Kang. She had been born in Enugu on the 7th of March, 41 years ago, to a mother who taught secondary school mathematics and a father who was a customs officer at the port of On. She had read law at King's College London and had taken a master's in forensic accounting at the LSE. She had lost 13 kilos in the last 2 years, and her cheekbones stood out now in a way that made her look, in the honeyed evening light, like a woman who had walked back into a room she had left in another life. In her right hand, she held a small velvet box the size of her palm. She had been invited by his mother. She had come. And Min Jae, standing at the altar in the champagne-colored roselight beside a bride he had chosen and a family he had married into, was the only person in the garden who did not yet understand what her presence meant. His mother crossed the lawn slowly, unhurried, took Adese's hand and said, in a voice that carried without effort to the 3rd row of chairs, "Please, tell him the truth." Then, to her son, without turning, "Sit down, Aina." He sat on the front chair of the front row, and the guests, one by one, filed into the house. If you are already leaning in, pause here, just for a moment, and hit subscribe to Korean Mafia Family. Tap the bell so the next chapter finds you the moment it drops. What is about to unfold in the next 28 minutes will unwrite your understanding of loyalty, of debt, of what it means to owe a life in 3 places, and rebuild it with something quieter, more forensic, and far more human than what you walked in with. Stay with us. You are going to want to be in this garden for what comes next, and for what comes after the garden, and for the room in Pyeongchang-dong at 4 in the morning where the real conversation happens. And when it is over, tell me one thing in the comments. What is the promise you made once that you have kept for everyone except the person you made it to? To understand what happened in that garden, you have to go back 11 years and 2 months to a soul that no longer exists in either of their memories the way it actually was, because time has done to it what time does to every city. It has replaced the buildings and left the weather. They had met on the 4th of February at a book launch on the 2nd floor of a small independent shop in Hyewadong for a translation of an Igbo novel into Korean. She was 29. She had flown in from London for the launch because she had translated 3 chapters of the book as a favor to her mentor, without payment. He was 30. He had come because his youngest cousin had begged him for a ride and had abandoned him for a boy near the wine table within 8 minutes. She was reading a passage aloud in Korean she had learned in 3 years of night classes above a noodle shop in Bloomsbury. and her Korean was precise but unbeautiful, and something in the way she leaned into the microphone to hide the unbeautifulness of it had made him stay for the whole reading. They had spoken afterwards for 19 minutes near the stack of unsold copies. He had not told her his family's name. She had not asked. She had told him, in the taxi they had taken together to the same subway station, that her Igbo middle name meant the one God has brought, and he had said, in Korean, that his grandmother would have liked her, and she had understood the sentence to be the kind of sentence a Korean man does not say lightly, and she had been correct. They had married 13 months later, in a ceremony that had cost the equivalent of 2 months' rent, in the courtyard of a hanok his grandmother owned in Bukchon. His grandmother had cooked the samgyetang herself, the last time she would cook it for a guest, and had held Adaisy's hand across the low table and had said, in a Korean too old-fashioned for Adaisy to fully understand, that a house is not a house until a stranger has been fed in it twice. Adaisy had wept without noise. The old woman had wiped the tears from her cheek with the pad of her thumb and had said, in English she had never spoken in front of anyone else, "You are home." They had lived, for the first 4 years, above a laundromat in Sinchon, in a 2-room apartment with a balcony that leaked in the summer and a boiler that seized in the winter. He had been building something. He had not yet told her what. And the something had almost failed twice, in the 3rd year and again in the 4th. During the worst month, the month the payroll for his 11 employees had come due on a Friday, and the loan he had expected on a Thursday had not arrived, she had walked without telling him to a pawn shop in Yongno and had sold her wedding ring for 4 million won, and had put the money in cash into an envelope on the kitchen table, and had said, when he had asked her where it had come from, only that she had received a translation fee. He had believed her. He had paid the 11 employees. He had found the ring, 6 months later, in the window of the same pawn shop, when the business had begun to breathe again, and he had bought it back for 4,200,000 won, and had placed it in a small lacquer box carved in Tongyong in 1974 that had belonged to his grandmother, and he had promised himself he would give it to Adays on their 10th anniversary. He had never given it to her. The anniversary had never come. They had lost a child in the 7th month of her 2nd pregnancy on the 14th of April, 6 years ago, at the 14th floor of Severance Hospital. The cardiologist on call had been a Dr. Yoon. The cause of death was recorded as a placental abruption with no identified secondary factor. The child had been a girl. They had named her, on the paper, Dr. Yoon slid across the desk with the pen already uncapped. Kang Ha-eun, Summer's Grace. And Adays had also given her the Igbo name Chidinma, God is Good, and the 2 names had been written on the certificate side by side in the 2 scripts, and the date had been written once, in the Gregorian, and Min Jae had signed it, and neither of them had spoken on the drive home. The grief had lived, after that, in the places between the rooms of the apartment above the laundromat, and then in the places between the rooms of the first house they had bought in Yeoksamdong, and then in the places between them, until the places between them had become larger than the places they shared. The divorce had been filed, quietly, 18 months later. She had asked for nothing. She had signed the papers in a lawyer's office in Gwanghwamun on a Tuesday morning, and had flown to London that evening, and had not returned to Seoul until his mother had called her 3 weeks ago, and had asked her, in a voice that did not permit refusal, to come. The room to which she led him now, at 10:14 that night, after the guests had left, and the orchestra had packed its instruments, and the champagne-colored roses had begun to bruise in the cooling air, was not a room he had expected. It was his own study on the second floor of the Pyeongchang-dong house, and on the low, black walnut table in the center of it, beside a pot of barley tea his mother had brewed at some point in the last hour, sat a manila folder 3 centimeters thick. Beside the folder sat the small velvet box she had been holding in the garden. Beside the box sat the lacquer box from Tongyong. Adaze sat on the far side of the table in a chair she had not chosen. His new wife, Ji-won, sat on the near side in the chair beside his, still in the Mikado gown, her hands folded in her lap in the way she had been taught by her mother to fold them when a room required her attention and not her voice. His mother stood at the window with her back to all of them, looking out into the garden where the caterers were folding chairs. Adaz opened the folder. She did not look at him when she began to speak. The transfers, she said, started 31 months ago. They had begun, she said, from a shell company registered in Lab 1 under the name Meridian Pacific Holdings, whose beneficial owner had, through 3 nominee layers, been traced to a private banker at a Zurich institution who had once served as the personal financial advisor to Chairman Yu Sung-chul. The transfers had moved in tranches of 4,300 million, one through correspondent accounts in Singapore and Jeju, into a maritime insurance vehicle registered in Vladivostok, and from there into the accounts of a logistics subsidiary that was, she paused here and looked at him for the first time, jointly owned by Kang Logistics and Yu Shipping under the pre-merger structure that had been signed by his lawyer at 11:47 in the morning on the previous Thursday. The vehicle in Vladivostok had, over the last 28 months, been used to move a category of container manifests that a customs inspector in Busan named Park had flagged in an internal memo dated the 8th of November. Inspector Park had died on the 12th of November of what was recorded as a myocardial infarction at a soju bar in Yeongdo-gu, 3 doors from his apartment, at the age of 46. He had been reported by his wife to be in good health. The autopsy had been declined by the family. That was the first death. The second death, she said, had been a compliance officer at the Singapore branch of the correspondent bank, a woman named Rachel Tan, who had refused, in an email dated the 4th of January, to countersign a batch of 3 transfers totaling 12,900,000,000 won. On the 17th of January, she had been found in her apartment in Bukit Timah, having fallen from a balcony that did not, according to her sister, admit access without a stepladder she did not own. Singaporean police had ruled the death a suicide within 72 hours. The email of the 4th of January had been retrieved, she said, from a backup server by a forensic team she had personally instructed. The email was in the folder on page 41. The third death, she said, was Kang Min-jae's own uncle, his father's younger brother, Kang Sung-ho, who had drowned in the Han River on the 2nd of March in what the police report had described as an accident consistent with intoxication. Sung-ho had been, at the time of his death, the sole signatory on a trust deed that would, on the day of Min-jae's marriage into the Yu family, have transferred 41% of the voting shares of Kang Logistics into a holding structure controlled by Chairman Yu. With Sung-ho dead, the signatory power had passed, by Clause 7 of the trust, to Min-jae himself. And with Min-jae married into the Yu family, the same 41% would transfer on the 14th day after the wedding, by operation of the pre-nuptial agreement, into a joint marital vehicle whose managing director, under a private side letter Min-jae had not read past the 3rd page, would be Chairman Yu. In 14 days, she said, they would have controlled the brotherhood in everything but name. In 4 to 6 months after that, they would not have needed him alive. She closed the folder. She placed her hand on top of it, flat, the way his mother had placed her hand on the brass rice bowl at the Jisa. "I came back," she said, "because your mother called me. And because I am the only forensic accountant in the world who has ever balanced your books." That was the second quotable line. He did not speak for a long time. He read 3 pages of the folder. He set the folder down. He turned the small velvet box in his hand once and did not open it. He looked at his new wife, Ji-won, whose face had gone very still in a way that was not shock, and who reached across the table and placed her own hand, briefly, on top of Adaisy's. Then he looked at Adaisy and asked the 2 questions he needed to ask. "How long have you known?" "Since the 14th of April last year," she said, "the date on which their daughter would have turned 6. "Why did you not come sooner?" She was quiet for the length of a breath. "Because I needed to be sure," she said. "And because I did not know if you would believe me if I came before there were 3 deaths on the paper." That was the third quotable line. Then she said the fourth. She spoke it without looking at him, looking instead at the lacquer box on the table between them, and her voice did not rise, and her hands did not move. And the sentence, when it ended, seemed to have taken all the light in the room with it as it passed. "I did not come back for the man who forgot the photograph on the balcony in Sinchon," she said. "That man I buried a long time ago in a small ceremony no one attended. I came back for the boy who paid 11 salaries the Friday I sold my ring, because that boy is still somewhere inside you, and he is the only one of you who is worth the 3 lives it has cost to keep him breathing." That was the fourth quotable line. Ji-won, beside him, did not weep. She sat very still. Then she stood in her Mikado gown and walked around the table and placed her hand briefly on Adaisy's shoulder and said in a voice so quiet only the 3 of them heard it, "Thank you for loving him when he had nothing, and for coming back now when he has too much." Adaise did not turn. She placed her own hand over Ji-won's for 1 second. Then Ji-won returned to her seat, and his mother, at the window, closed the curtains. At 6:41, the following morning, Kang Min-jae walked into the 22nd floor boardroom of Kang Logistics in Yeoksamdong. He wore the same charcoal suit from the wedding, without the overcoat. He carried a leather portfolio under his left arm. 7 men sat around the table. 6 of them were the senior directors of the Brotherhood, men he had known since he was 19. The 7th, at the far end of the table, in the seat that had traditionally been left for the founding generation, was his sworn brother of 22 years, the man he had called Tae-hoon-ah, since they had shared a dormitory bunk at Yonsei, who had been the best man at his first wedding, who had held Ha-eun's small paper-wrapped body on the drive from Severance to the family plot in Yangpyeong. Tae-hoon was the chief operating officer of Kang Logistics. He was also, according to the 4th section of Adaisy's folder, the account holder at the Zurich institution, and the man who had introduced Chairman Yu's banker to Meridian Pacific Holdings in a meeting at the Park Hyatt in November of the previous year. Min-jae did not sit. He opened the portfolio and placed 6 objects on the black walnut table, one at a time, in silence. He placed the printed email from Rachel Ton. He placed the customs memo from Inspector Park. He placed a photocopy of the Meridian Pacific Incorporation document. He placed a coroner's note from the police station in Yongdo-gu, obtained through a channel he did not name. He placed a USB drive, black, unmarked. He placed, last, the photograph from the balcony in Sinchon, face down, so that only the sentence in blue ink was visible. He looked at the far end of the table. "Tae-hoon-ah," he said. "Say something." Tae-hoon did not speak. He did not lift his eyes from the table. He did not reach for the USB drive. He did not touch the photograph. His hands remained flat on the wood in front of him, and the 6 other directors who had known him for as long as Min-jae had watched his hands and understood, one by one, without a word being spoken, what the silence meant. The silence lasted 1 minute and 11 seconds. Min-jae counted it in his head, the way his grandmother had once counted the seconds between lightning and thunder on a porch in Andong. That was the 5th quotable line, the silence itself at the end of the table, from a man who had once been asked to name a child and had chosen the name Ha-eun. Min-jae closed the portfolio. He turned. He walked to the door. At the door he stopped and said, without turning, that the 6 directors would find the transfer documentation on the desk of the compliance officer by 9 a.m., and that any of them who had known and had not spoken should submit a resignation to the same desk by noon. Then he left. 3 of the 6 resigned before 11. The court order came down on the 23rd of April. It was numbered 2025-Hyung-Sang-1147, and it froze the assets of Meridian Pacific Holdings and its 4 nominee entities under an emergency provision of the Special Act on the Prevention of Illegal Fund Transfers. The indictment against Tae-hoon was handed down on the 29th of April under docket number 2025-Go-Hap-2233. The indictment against the Zurich banker was handed down through mutual legal assistance on the 11th of May. Chairman Yoo Sang-chul was named in a joint press release from the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office and the Financial Supervisory Service on the 18th of May as a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. The Chosun Ilbo did not report the wedding again. The Financial Times reported the freezing of Meridian Pacific in a 400-word article on page 11 of its Asia edition on the 24th of April, without using Min-jae's name. Min-jae did not attend the press conference. On the morning of the 23rd, he drove alone, in a car he had not driven himself in 7 years, to the family plot outside Yangpyeong. He walked through the low iron gate, past the graves of his father and his grandfather and his grandmother, to the small stone at the eastern edge of the plot on which 2 names had been carved in 2 scripts and 1 date. He sat on the cold ground in front of the stone for 41 minutes. He did not speak. He did not weep. He brushed a piece of pollen from the top of the stone with the pad of his thumb, in the way his mother had brushed the tears from Adase's cheek 11 years ago in a hanok in Bukchon, and then he stood and walked back to the car. He began, that week, a slow calendar of small returns. On the 25th of April, he sent a box of Naju pears to the door of the small apartment in Hanam-dong that Adaese had rented on her return. He did not include a note. On the 2nd of May, he sent, by the hand of his mother's oldest domestic worker, a jar of doenjang his mother had made in an earthenware crock in the courtyard of the Bukchon hanok. On the 9th of May, he sent a slim volume of poems by Kim Hae-soon in the original Korean, with a facing English translation, marked with a single silk ribbon at a poem about the mothers of drowned children. On the 16th of May, he sent nothing. On the 23rd of May, he sent a photocopy of the deed to the Bukchon hanok, transferred into the name of the foundation his grandmother had established, with a handwritten note that said only, "For the girls, if you would." On the 30th of May, at 4:12 in the afternoon, she knocked on the door of his mother's kitchen. She was carrying a small dish of jollof rice she had cooked herself. She said she would eat with his mother, not with him. He served the tea. He did not sit at the table. He stood by the window. They did not become husband and wife again. On the 17th of June, in the kitchen of the Bukchon Hanok, at 11:47 in the morning, over a bowl of samgyetang his mother had cooked the way his grandmother had once cooked it, Adaizi set down her spoon and stated her new terms. She did not raise her voice. She had never raised her voice. "I will not be your wife again," she said. "I will not take your name. I will not live in your house. I will accept the directorship of the foundation you have offered me, and I will run it from an office in Anguk-dong that you will not enter without an appointment. I will have dinner with your mother on the last Sunday of every month. I will attend the Jesa for Ha-un on the 14th of April every year in the Hanok with your mother. I will not attend it with you. On the 10th year after Ha-un's birth, if we are both alive, I will meet you at her stone in Yangpyeong." Not before. That was the 6th quotable line. He set down his own spoon. He did not look at her. He looked, instead, at his mother, who was standing at the counter slicing a pear into eighths. "Yes," he said. His new wife, Ji-won, filed for the annulment of the marriage on the 11th of June, on the ground of fraud in the inducement, citing the pre-nuptial agreement and the concealment of the Meridian Pacific structure by her father. The annulment was granted on the 3rd of August, uncontested. She kept the Mikado gown folded in acid-free tissue in a cedar chest because she said to Adaiz over a coffee at a small cafe in Samcheong-dong on a Wednesday afternoon in July that she wanted her daughter, if she ever had one, to know what a woman had worn on the night she had learned who her father was, and had chosen, before the wine had been poured, to leave. She and Adaiz began to meet, without Min-jae, once a fortnight. He was not told the dates. He did not ask. On a Sunday in late September, at 3:14 in the afternoon, an old woman arrived at the Pyeongchang-dong house without an appointment. She was small. She wore a long gray coat and carried a leather handbag that had been repaired twice at the handles. She was Adaizi's mother. She had flown in from Enugu on a ticket Adaizi had not paid for. She had been driven from the airport by a man Min-jae's mother had sent. She sat in the study, in the same chair Adaizi had sat in 5 months earlier, and she accepted a cup of barley tea, and she did not touch it. Min-jae's mother sat beside her on the low sofa and held her hand. She spoke in English, slowly, in the way of a woman who had taught it as a second language for 31 years. "My eldest daughter," she said, "was not Adaizi." Min-jae did not move. "My eldest was Chinwe. She died in 2007 in a courtroom in Lagos, of a heart that stopped when a judge read a verdict in a case that had been bought. She was 23. The man who bought the verdict is now in prison, but not for that." Adaiz was 14. She stood in the gallery and she watched her sister fall. She has been, since that day, in the business of reading the paperwork that men do not think women read. She paused. "The prosecutor in Seoul who is handling your case," she said, "is the son of the barrister who represented Chinwe. He was a boy of 9 at the funeral. His father sent him to Yonsei on a scholarship the Nigerian bar arranged for the children of murdered advocates. Adaiz knew him at university. She knew him when she was translating chapters of an Igbo novel above a noodle shop in Bloomsbury. She did not marry you because he asked her to watch you. She married you because my husband died on the same day she met you. And she believed my husband had sent her a sign. When she saw what your uncle was building around you 3 years ago, she did not come to you. She went to the prosecutor. She has been building the case for 31 months. The 3 deaths were not caused by her waiting. They were caused by the men who moved faster than she could get you out of the room. She has carried them. She will carry them. She turned the untouched cup of tea a quarter turn on its saucer. "I have come," she said, "to ask one thing. Chinwe left a daughter. She is 19. She is at university in Nsuka, reading law. Her name is Amara Ha-un Ifechi, Amara meaning grace in Igbo. Ha-un given to her by Adaizi on the phone from Sinchon, the week after Chinwe died. She does not know that Ha-un was also the name of the child you and Adaizi lost. She does not need to know. I ask that the foundation your grandmother founded, which you have now placed in Adaizi's name, establish a scholarship for the daughters of murdered advocates in West Africa and in Korea, and that the scholarship be named in both names, the Kang Ha-un and Ifechi Chinwe Scholarship. I ask that you sign the deed today. I ask that you do not read past the 3rd page." She placed the deed on the table between them. Min Jae did not read past the 3rd page. He signed on the 4th. He did not know what was on the 4th page. He would learn, 3 years later, that the 4th page committed him to fund the scholarship in perpetuity from a private account he had not previously touched, and that the account had been named, at his grandmother's instruction in her will, for a granddaughter she had never met, in a country she had never visited, on a continent she had once dreamed about on a porch in Andong. He would not regret the signing. He would remember instead that Adaizi's mother had asked him for one thing and had trusted him to sign without reading, and that the not reading had been the only gift he had left to give. That was the 7th quotable line, the small unread signature on the 4th page of a deed placed on a black walnut table by an old woman from Enugu, in a house in Pyeongchang-dong on a Sunday afternoon in September at 3:41. He bowed to her from the waist, the deep bow of a son to a mother who is not his own, and she reached out with a hand that had washed the body of her elder daughter, and she touched, for 1 second, the crown of his head. On the wall of the entrance hall of the Foundation's office in Anguk-dong, above the low bench where visitors are asked to remove their shoes, there hangs a photograph in a plain wooden frame. It shows 2 young people, no older than 30, standing under the balcony of a rented apartment in Sinchon in the rain, laughing, the woman's dark hand pressed flat against the wet lapel of the man's cheap gray suit. Beneath the photograph, in 3 lines of small typography, in Hangul, in the Latin alphabet, and in Igbo, is written, "For the ones who fed us, for the ones we lost, for the ones still coming." And beneath that, one date, the 14th of April. A man buries his dead and calls it grief, and calls the grief a wound, and spends the rest of his life defending the wound. A better man buries his dead and calls it a debt, and spends the rest of his life paying the debt to the living who look nothing like him and everything like the ones he lost. If you have read a face in this story that looks like yours, or like a woman you did not thank, or like a man you did not warn, tell me in the comments one thing. Whose ring did you sell, and did you ever ask, before you spent the money, whether it was theirs to give? And when you are ready for the next chapter, the chapter about the son who arrives in Seoul from Nsuka on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 years after this photograph was hung, carrying a letter he was not supposed to read, subscribe to Korean Mafia Family. Tap the bell. Sit in the front chair of the front row. We are keeping the seat warm for you, and there is barley tea on the table, and the door is not locked. It has never been locked. It is only that, until tonight, you did not know it was your door.